Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm here today with another great Kentucky author, Mr. Jeff Winstead. How you doing?
I'm good, Jameson. How are you doing?
Doing good. You recently got done with a book, "The Last Battle of the Last Battle of the Revolutionary War." A lot of people probably would maybe throw an eyebrow up as how is that connected to Kentucky, but it's a big connection, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly what I did when I first heard it. So that's what got me interested in the first place.
Yeah. Well, before we get too much into the book and so forth, tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connection.
Sure. So I was born in Louisville. I spent my childhood years, early childhood years there. My family moved to a microscopic town in Hart County called Cub Run. And so it's south central Kentucky, so it's kind of around the Mammoth Cave area.
Uh huh.
And I grew up there, went back to college in Louisville, went to U of L. First couple years, and then finished up. I went to art school in Georgia, finished my college there, met my wife, and we've kind of been bouncing around ever since then. So
Yeah. And right now, we're recording this. You're in California. A little
that's
bit of a
right.
time gap. Um,
That's right.
but is it true? I mean, they always say if you're a Kentucky boy, you got one foot where you're at, the other foot's headed back or pointed back to Kentucky.
That's pretty much true. Yeah, my dad's traveled quite a bit too, and he always says Kentucky's the most beautiful country. I mean,
Uh-huh.
and he's a Kentucky boy too. He's my parents are from Harlan, so they're from
Yeah.
Eastern Kentucky, and it is beautiful country, man. It's hard to compete. So it's there's just something about it,
Yeah.
that's wonderful and fantastic. So we get back whenever we can. It's been a while. This most
Mhm.
recent stretch, we're hoping to get back in August. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's well, I'm probably a little biased, but
sure,
probably
sure,
most of the listeners here are biased too, so they all agree.
absolutely, yeah.
It's the best. So when we're talking about the last battle of the Revolutionary War, a lot of people forget completely about what would be called the Western Front of the war.
That's right.
Things that were going on in Kentucky, many sieges and stuff of forts, early settlers. But let's talk about the actual battle. What battle are we talking about? I guess I should ask.
Right. So we're talking about the Battle of Blue Licks, which took place on the Licking River and it's not spoiling the book of 1782 in August. So in the heat of the summer, currently there's a state park there now. So the Blue Licks
Hmm.
Battlefield Resort and State Park is located in that right on the battlefield. There's a memorial for it. Um, and so, yeah, that's sort of what we're talking about. It's um, specifically in terms of Daniel Boone, a lot of stuff in his life happened in that general area. Uh, so it's a very significant part of Kentucky history.
Yeah, and when a lot of people associate Daniel Boone and Kentucky
Yeah,
pretty much hand in hand, and it's very true
right.
to that. And this your book definitely focuses on Daniel Boone a lot. Uh, but as far as the setup, the prelim of the battle, the siege of Bryant Station had just taken place,
That's
and
right.
which your
Yeah.
book kind of it takes it kind of begins a little bit before that. It kind of leads into that. I don't want to tell. Well, I always when I'm talking to these historical authors or event. I'm like, I don't want to spoil the book, but most likely they might already the
Yeah.
ending's
This is
already out there.
yeah. Since it's historical fiction. I mean, the events are true. Obviously, I had to
Uh-huh.
invent conversations and that kind of stuff. I kept it as true to it. The history is a scaffolding on which you
Yeah,
kind of build the narrative when you're doing this kind of work with real life people. And so yeah, it's always the challenge. If I know someone's reading the book, I don't tell them who lives, who dies, that kind of stuff if they don't already know. But it is
yeah,
challenging because it is real history.
yeah.
And so yeah, the I actually well, I don't know how much we want to. Yeah. So I actually started the book in 1776 to sort of give us a little bit of introduction to Boone. And yeah, I shoot the whole book through the prism of Boone, although different parts of the book I focus on different characters, like his son-in-law, his actual
Hmm.
son Israel, uh, some stuff like that. I try to mix it up a bit. There's a lot of moving parts, and as I was researching it, some of the stuff I actually had to leave on the cutting room floor. I mean, the
Oh,
connections are so. You would think when you, it's true what they say that history is actually truth is stranger than fiction, right?
yeah.
So as I'm writing it, and the deeper I get into the research, and and I've been researching it for years, and up to the minute I was doing the first draft, I was still discovering stuff about how one character was connected to another, because it's a very small population in Kentucky at
Yeah.
that time, and everyone pretty much knew everybody else, and so yeah, so but yeah, I do shoot everything through the prism of Boone because that was sort of my fascination with the book in the first place. Uh, my uh, my wife and I were living in North Carolina at the time. This was 2005, and she picked up a paper there, and there was a travel article about Blue Licks, and they give a brief history of the battle. And my wife said, "Oh, have you heard of this?" And I was embarrassed. I said,
Yeah.
"Actually, I hadn't."
Uh-huh.
And then I started thinking about, so I never heard of this battle, and I really didn't know that much about Daniel Boone.
Uh-huh.
I had a vague idea of who he was, maybe coonskin cat, maybe not. Am I confusing him with Davy Crockett? And it really struck me that I had I had one school memory of a teacher wheeling in a television set so we could watch a Daniel Boone program on Kentucky Educational Television.
Uh-huh.
This was like seventh grade, and that was literally the last time I thought about Daniel Boone for 20 years.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so that sort of hit me like a hammer. Like
Hmm.
I really should know more. This is my heritage.
Yeah.
I really should know more about this. And so I started doing research on Boone and then the battle in particular. And once I got to the battle, I thought this is a story. I mean, I can't
Oh
believe
yeah.
this is a story that hasn't been told, that more people aren't familiar with, that hasn't been dramatized.
Hmm.
Just so much rich human elements, pathos, all that stuff you need
Hmm.
for a good tale.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, and that's one thing that is so captivating, I guess, and especially early Kentucky history. And I know I'm being biased in this, but whenever I start looking at just all the working parts, they knew each other. They were all
Yeah,
connected, and even
right,
even for the next decades, like you just have so many connections
right,
that, and
right.
and you're like, how is this not dramatized and so forth? And
Yeah,
I mean, they had the old Daniel Boone TV show back in the 50s
Right.
and 60s, but that was all just entertainment. And I never watched
Sure.
them. I've never watched them, but
I've barely seen, I know a little bit of the theme song. I've seen,
uh-huh.
I've seen a part of an episode. But yeah, same with me. I actually made a point not to watch it as I was writing the
Yeah,
books. I didn't want that to influence the voice of the characters.
yeah, yeah.
So,
And just with when you bring Daniel Boone into it, it's all just. I mean, it's he's just everywhere when it comes to Kentucky and
yeah,
kind of the early settlers. Um, and his story alone, I mean, being captured by the Shawnee and all that kind of
right,
stuff, and it is just captivating as well. Um,
right.
but one thing I really enjoyed about your book, and thanks again for sending it. And, let me read it.
No, I appreciate
It,
it.
it's always a bit of a benefit to have read it,
Yeah,
before.
right, right.
Yeah. Uh, but it, I read a lot of these books, and they're very factual based, and you know sometimes they can be a little like, oh gosh, okay, let's just get to what's going on, a little too much heavy on the
Right,
facts.
right,
But
right.
with yours, I did not feel that at all. I the way you laid it out, I would very much like, well, as I was reading, I was thinking, this is like a movie. I'm like, what reading a book for that could be a movie easily, if that makes sense. Um, but very very much entertaining. I knew what was going to happen the whole time, but I was still constantly, all right, let's keep
Right,
reading,
right.
and we got to keep going. Uh, so really, as far as that goes, great job on your end.
Oh, thanks.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's definitely was a challenge. Was I learned so much researching the book that I had to resist information dumping on the reader because I
Uh-huh.
just wanted to tell all this information about daily life, uh, how horses, the way that the horses were integrated into their lifestyle, livestock, growing crops. But if it wasn't relative to the story, I just had to cut it, or
Yeah, yeah,
at least trim it down enough. Even like you were mentioned, Daniel being kidnapped by the Shawnee. Like I had
that's
to
a whole.
mention that, but that's
Yeah,
a whole story in and of itself. So I had to
yeah.
kind of feed details of that, in the siege of Boonesboro, uh,
Hmm.
the all that stuff because it's relevant to the story. Like you don't really appreciate exactly what's happening at the Blue Licks battle unless you know that stuff, but
Uh-huh.
it has to be told in a way that either the book isn't 4,000 pages or
Yeah,
that you can
yeah.
get it across and still make it entertaining and inform the reader at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if it's 4,000 page book, even as much as I do love Kentucky history, I'm
Right.
probably just not going to dive into that one.
Even though I guess we're
It
going to
can.
break it up into a few different volumes at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like there's so many working parts. Like I know about Hugh McGarry, you know,
Yes. Yeah.
you know, but and you talk about taking incentives, but it's very well documented that he was a hothead and not really that, uh, that. So I mean, like, where do you draw the line of like, I can take it. I can take this way. I can, maybe I should. How do you judge that? Because I mean, that's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah. And even though we're dealing with people who have been dead for 200 years plus in some cases, I I was careful not to want to villainize someone
Hmm.
without at least explaining perhaps why they were the way they were,
Hmm.
and and not just pick someone to be a villain just for the sake of it to try to try to
Yeah.
try to do right by the people within the context of the story, as if they were people who were still alive today. So, if
Hmm.
I met them in a bar, that I wouldn't
Yeah.
be too worried. I might get decked by McGarry. I mean, McGarry and Caldwell might throw a punch, but at least I could say, well, that's kind of on you too.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, McGarry in particular, the uh, without giving too much away, he's instrumental in the battle. And as you research it, there's various stories. One story goes one way, the other story goes the other. Although, from what I've read, it looked like McGarry, in his own words, admitted his complicity
Yeah.
in what happened during the battle.
Hmm.
So I sort of I use as much information I could as a touchstone, but for most of these people, there aren't interviews. We either
Yeah.
have to see what they wrote in their own letters. In the case of Boone did an interview or two by this soon hereafter, but some of it, like the Filson Boone,
Yeah.
is such a mythological character but
Uh-huh.
none of that language is really Boone's language.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to strip that down too. And so maybe you might have a son like Nathaniel, obviously wrote a lot with Simon Draper about Daniel,
Mhm.
and so that's a little more authentic. You can pick details from there. Yeah, some characters I had to invent a personality, almost out of whole cloth, or just a handful of anecdotes.
Yeah.
And then Boone, Rebecca, um, those characters were a little more fleshed out in history books, so I
Yeah.
could sort of create a character based on a lot more information, which was easier.
Yeah. 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 Well, I think of what about Jemima? Is there as much about her, or is I mean,
Yeah, there's quite a bit, but the most important thing, at least for the Jemima as my character in the book, was people are familiar with the story, the kidnapping
yeah.
of the girls, which I use that as the introduction to the characters and the scenario in the very first chapter of the book,
Mhm.
which some people have written whole books about just that, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
event, and it's obviously famously Last of the Mohicans is loosely based on that story.
Hmm.
So it's a very famous story, and I thought, let's just get this out of the way. Let's dispense with it right at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
But from Jemima's standpoint, what struck me as I was reading the history was what she got from that was from that moment on, she was very close to her father.
Hmm.
And so I used that as sort of to make her a touchstone to her dad's temper, kind of like reining him in times when he might be not thinking things through clearly when she was
Yeah.
around. And because one of the other, not to get mix up our stories too much here, but uh, she and her husband are the only people who stay when Daniel's kidnapped by the Shawnee. The rest of the family go back to North
Go
Carolina.
back. Yeah.
So she was so confident that he was going to come back that she basically stayed to wait for them. And I thought that was to wait for him to come back. So I thought that was powerful. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
was mostly the way I wrote her with that in that context.
Well, kind of that building that bigger connection that
Yes.
she didn't want to leave and so forth.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, it's a pretty compelling story, and like as far as the battle didn't last long. Um,
Right.
you know, um, some casualties. We'll try to save off.
Yeah.
If most people may already know, but we'll
Sure.
save off. But one thing as I read the book, you get a story, and you go 100 different ways. But if I could say, this was more of a story about a father and a son, and
Yes.
in that sense, everything else is kind of going on around, but that's kind of the connecting uh,
Yes.
thing going through the whole story, and uh, it pulls on some heartstrings. I gotta say, there's definitely some,
Yeah.
even knowing the ending, I still was like, oh man, I know what this chapter is about, and so forth.
Right.
Uh, I mean, going on with that, I mean, easy to write about, or just, um,
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it. I'm a son myself, so I kind of have strong father figure. So
uh-huh,
you sort of understand the way some of these dynamics work. And that's the thing. Even though this was 240 years ago, uh, we all sort of go through these same relationships today.
mhm,
The trappings are different, but we all can kind of understand what it's like to be a son, a daughter, brother, sister. Even I don't have kids myself, but I can kind of project, you know,
mhm,
what that is like enough to tell the story. And Israel, um, obviously, very important to the book. And it, again, this is where I kind of, by doing the research, looking at things that weren't said, but seemed to me to be part of his character, which is I noticed that Israel disappears from Boone's story during very significant elements of his life. So when Jemima and the Callaway girls are kidnapped, Israel's not around.
mhm.
When the siege of Boonesboro happens, Israel's in North Carolina with his mother and the rest of the family because he's now the man of the
Yeah,
family, with Daniel
yeah,
being gone and with his older brother having already been killed at a,
mhm,
at a failed uh, uh, first introduction to Kentucky
yeah,
uh, by Indians.
yeah,
And so Israel, what I took from that is Israel was a man who probably had many more adventures than I mean, obviously that I have had in my life because it's a
yeah,
frontier.
well, yeah,
But in his mind, compared to his father, he wasn't living the adventurous life that his father had lived, is the way I framed the character. So he was this young man who's longing for adventure, opportunity, a little bit of fame, like a lot of young
Well,
people are.
yeah.
And so I sort of framed the relationship around that, and of course the typical element of fathers and sons don't always understand each other.
Yeah.
They kind of do and kind of don't, and
Uh,
it can be tense at moments.
if they would just talk to each other, they would probably figure it
Yeah,
out very
talking
easily.
the real
But
way, exactly. But there's a lot
yeah,
of not talking directly. Things that
yeah,
aren't really said that should be said.
yeah, yeah, and kind of that living under his father's shadow,
Yeah,
kind of sense.
right. Because by this point, Boone is already essentially a legend in his own time.
Yeah,
And so depending on who you are and how well you know Boone, that's the reason I opened the book with the rescue of the Jemima and the Callaway girls, because that is the moment where, for most of that story, spread like wildfire through the rest of to the East Coast. So, you know, people knew of Boone, countrywide by
yeah,
that point. And if you were one of Boone's more age, if you were a peer of Boone's, he's just a guy that you hang around with who happens to be a little more famous now. But if you're a generation or two below, who don't know him as well, that's why I introduced. There's a character called Aaron Reynolds, and Reynolds, the way I write him in the book, he is a great fan of Daniel's
yeah,
because he knows him, but he kind of knows him from afar. So he knows Daniel as more of a mythological figure than, say, John Todd,
yeah.
uh, who's a major in the battle. That we get that showed that their stories kind of sync up, later in the book.
Now I gotta bring up, one of the characters that's mentioned. I don't think he's ever mentioned as far as speaking, but he's mentioned a bunch. Benjamin Logan. I'm right here in Stanford,
Right,
a few
right.
miles from. I was waiting to get some Benjamin Logan dialogue, but just never he never got there.
Yeah, and that's yeah, his absence is actually one of the most important
Oh
aspects of the
yeah,
book. And again, going back to his previous relationship with Daniel, and Daniel maybe having a little resentment towards him, and seemingly vice versa. Uh, just to give a little bit of backstory, there was a sense Daniel was kidnapped with a group of men from Boonesboro who were boiling salt at Blue Licks, and the feeling among some of the people that were back home in Boonesboro was that Daniel had surrendered the men without putting up much of a fight. Now, what probably happened is that Daniel was trying to keep him off from getting killed.
yeah,
And matter of fact, he had arranged for the rest of the men to not be harmed on the forced march back to Chillicothe, back to Ohio.
yeah,
But Daniel forgot to make the same deal for himself, and the Indians, when they got back, they made him run the gauntlet.
yeah.
Basically, which made you basically run in a straight line, and men, women, and
They-
children from the village basically stone you.
yeah, yeah.
And some people don't survive that. I think Boone and Kenton both had that experience.
Can't yeah.
Both
Can't
survived.
many times I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yes. So the
All
court
that.
martial, yeah. So once Boone escapes, warns them that there's a siege coming. There's a battle. They fight off the siege. Well, after that, Boone's court-martialed, and Logan is a key player in that. So Daniel had resented his. Obviously, you would.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, the whole thing delayed him from going back to North Carolina to get Rebecca to bring her back to Kentucky, and
And I'm
really
sure.
damaged his reputation.
Yeah, and I'm sure in his mind he's like, I did all this, to help save the fort. I mean, we
Right,
saved the fort. Everybody's
right,
and here I'm being,
yeah.
charged with all that. And what's this? What's the saying? Shoot, I can't think of it. No wrong, not two wrongs don't make a right. But is
Right,
another
yeah.
saying? No good deed goes unpunished. That's what it is.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
this seemed to be a case of that. So that experience taints Boone's thinking on what might be the best way forward in approaching the Blue Lick situation. And so the tons of that with just the way the characters interact with each other and their histories, and so you have to get that across as best you can without weighing the story down, essentially.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Which I mean, I'm a little biased. Being here, so close to Stanford, Fort Logan, or Logan's Fort, all that stuff. Benjamin Logan, he's one of my faves.
Yeah, oh yeah,
But also with Boone had little issues with James Harriet as well, which James Harriet, I don't think he's not in it at all. Is he?
no, no,
I mean,
no.
because I was going through my trying to think, but I didn't remember him being mentioned much, which he didn't
Yeah,
have anything really to do with
sure.
the battle or anything. So, um, but yeah, it's really good. What you mentioned before you had to cut some stuff out. What was some stuff that you really it's like, man, I really want this in, but I got to leave it out, or
There were two things. Well, one was the antagonist of the story is William Caldwell, essentially. One of the two main antagonists, I guess.
yeah,
And he's a British captain, and he's leading a force of. He's got 50 Rangers, which is they're everybody's familiar with the British Redcoats. These are not the British Redcoats. These are elite. This is the SEAL team essentially
yeah, yeah,
of the British, and he's leading that and a force of 300 Indians into Kentucky where they siege Bryan Station.
yeah,
And so Caldwell, as I'm digging into it, apparently Boone had testified against him in some sort of a land dispute a few years earlier. So they actually had a history where Caldwell may have had a personal sort of animus toward Boone, but I just
yeah.
couldn't, like, that was just too much to. It was
Uh-huh.
very interesting, but it didn't really fit the narrative.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other, there's Daniel has a nephew named Thomas,
Mhm.
and so apparently if you go to Blue Licks, I've actually never been. I'm going for the first time next month, but there's a monument, and then there's a secondary monument. So the monument has the names of all the casualties and I
Yeah.
think all the participants just in general. And then there's a secondary monument. I guess as years passed, they discovered more people had been involved who weren't.
Mhm.
And there's the name Thomas Boone, I believe it is. And well, best I could figure from many different Boone books and all the histories I could find, Thomas was like a 14-year-old kid at the
Oh.
time.
Yeah.
So I had two problems. One was I couldn't figure how he was there, considering militia age was, I believe, 18 and 18 to 50, maybe 18 to 52
Uh-huh.
at the time. Could have tagged along. Could have been, bringing supplies. Could have been helping out. I don't
Yeah.
know. The other thing becomes once you introduce a narrative where there's a 14-year-old kid who gets killed,
Yeah.
that's the story, and that wasn't the story you wanted to tell.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
if I could have known for sure that he was there, that would have been one thing. But since there was some ambiguity, I thought, well, I'm just
Mhm.
gonna cut this out because it doesn't really, like you said, the through line is Boone and his son,
Yeah.
and it didn't really fit the through line of the narrative.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and I mean, like we said before, you could probably find bits and pieces of this person, that person. You're like, oh man, everybody has a story leading up to it, or
yeah,
some sort of story you could probably swing in there.
right.
Eh, uh, Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so when I was at U of L,
Yeah.
movie companies they'll sometimes preview a movie for an audience, the test audience.
Yeah.
And so for some reason they brought this Bruce Lee, a movie, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, to U of L, and you got to see it for free. And at the end of the movie, you had to answer a questionnaire. How did you like the
Yeah.
movie? How did you like this character? Did this part work? Did it not? Just so they could decide if they wanted to re-edit the movie.
Uh-huh.
So I'm like I like Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee's cool. Didn't know a whole lot about his backstory, but
Yeah.
there was some fascinating stuff. And in one element of the movie, he's in Los Angeles. He wants to train. He wants to have non-Asian trainees,
Uh-huh.
and the other dojos don't want to allow it. They don't want him to share the knowledge with non-Chinese
Yeah.
individuals. So in the movie, he basically has a secret clandestine fight with like this, sort of all these leaders of these dojos, and this big guy he's fighting against, and he wins the fight. And after the fight's over, he goes to leave, and the guy ambushes him and kicks him in the back and breaks his back.
uh,
And so Bruce Lee's laid up with a broken
yeah.
back for months. Very powerful point in the movie. Well, come to find out by doing a little research afterwards, never happened.
Oh,
He broke his back lifting weights essentially. So
yeah.
now that's almost pushing it a little too far, like,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I try to avoid doing anything that if somebody found out the truth, they'd be that disappointed.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and there was so much interesting stuff that happened. You really didn't have to do that. I didn't have to make up much at all. There were a
Uh-huh.
couple of points where there were holes in. Um, so there's a point where so Boone at this point in his life is living in Boone Station. So he's left
Yeah,
Boonesboro, him and his family.
yeah.
And in all the books I read about the battle, so Boone has sent a patrol out to because he knows there's. I mean, obviously at this point in frontier Kentucky,
Mhm.
Indians attacks inflamed by the British are rampant.
Yeah,
So the British were essentially using the Shawnee, the Cherokee, as proxies to fight a war. Sometimes they would accompany them, sometimes not.
yeah,
It was just a way to sort of keep it was stir up unrest on the frontier.
yeah,
But for some particular, but Boone somehow knew that this was happening um, at this moment, so he has a patrol circling Boone Station. But I never could figure out how Boone got that information from the research I had done. So I had to
uh-huh.
invent. It's essentially
Yeah,
invent a reason just to make the story work. Or I'm sure there was a real reason. I just couldn't find it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And well, and I assume too you use a lot of journals and looking at journals and entries and so forth. You know,
Yeah.
even those don't tell all the details that you need to
No.
know.
No.
Uh, so you kind of, like you said, you have to kind of build around what you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
and so forth. Um, did and I know I talked to one author a while back, and not on the podcast, but they were just talking. How they will, instead of being in a, like saying their main character is Daniel Boone, they'll just invent a character to be there, and they
Right.
kind of narrate. I mean, how difficult would that be to plop somebody in there that's just there, I guess, narrating everything, but they're not even a real person, or
So Boone's still in the story, but somebody else is telling it from their perspective, basically.
yeah, like if they were there, you
Yeah.
know.
Um, so there's a character or two in the book that is totally invented,
Uh-huh.
but not for that purpose necessarily, but just to sort
Yeah.
of build out other characters or composite characters. So
Yeah.
they take. There's a Boone has an Indian friend who I introduced in the story named Sevanuka. He's the Raven,
Yeah.
and so that character is sort of he was real,
Yeah.
but the certain aspects of Boone's relationships with other Cherokee or other Indians from other tribes are sort of mentioned as if they were part of his story, just
Yeah.
to sort of get that information across to the
Yeah.
reader. Um, it was important for me to so Boone doesn't narrate the book, so there's third person narrator, but I didn't want any separation beyond that
Yeah.
from the reader in Boone
Mhm.
or any of the characters for that matter. So I wanted to make sure that when you're with Boone, you're really getting a sense of his emotions, not someone else's perception of his emotions, but you're really getting a sense of how he feels, how he's thinking through a particular problem or a particular relationship that he's having
Yeah. Yeah.
to sort of massage to get what he wants to get the end
Hmm.
result. Um, so yeah, that's interesting. I know there's a famous character, Corey Ten Boom. He's in
Hmm.
a lot of. They sort of drop him to like the Paul Revere story
Yeah.
and stuff
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, that would be interesting, but it never occurred to me to do it that way, frankly.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. And I mean, I guess when we think about documented people, Boone is pretty well documented,
yeah,
but it is those side people that when you get to you got Boone level, and then everybody else is kind of
yes,
goes down the
exactly.
tier, and you kind of really got to get get something more to I guess facilitate the story and so forth. Which Simon Kenton rolls up, which is another
Yes,
um, uh, he's pretty good documented, but just
yeah,
still just not as good as Boone.
Right,
Um,
right. Yes, yeah. And not as, I mean, not as involved in this particular story. So
mhm.
I really wanted to use him. And in fact, I'd love to do something with Kenton in the future. He's
Yeah,
such a fascinating character.
yeah,
But that's why I got him in where I could here because he was just so fun to write. You know,
yeah, yeah.
again, the fictionalized version that I'm writing, he was fun,
Yeah.
really fun to write that character.
Yeah. So another another good frontiersman that who always pops up. You get this when you're reading it. This guy keeps showing up everywhere. John Floyd is a good one that pops up. What did you use for him? Because he's not as not as well, not as much out there. Like he would be one you're probably putting. I feel like you'd be putting a puzzle together because he's very very crucial to Kentucky and those sorts of things. But what did you use for him or?
Yeah, Floyd, as you said, he pops up. If you're reading a Boone biography, he pops up in all of them at
Mhm.
various times. He sort of weaves in and out of Boone's life. Fascinating character, and this is another one. When I stumbled upon him early in my research, so I've been researching the book since 2005, on and off,
Oh wow. Yeah.
and in, I was originally going to do it as a comic book
Uh-huh.
actually. And
Yeah.
this is my first novel. It never occurred to me until a couple of years ago to even do it as a novel,
Yeah.
which I think served it better.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Floyd, he is the he's the Kentucky he's a Kentucky swashbuckler. You know, he's
Mhm.
like an Errol Flynn character who really existed in Kentucky. There's he during the Revolution uh, basically becomes a sailor. He never been a sailor before. He gets kidnapped. He gets taken to England. Uh, he so there's a very fantastical sort of Errol Flynn like escape to get him back to America. Really, really
Uh-huh.
fascinating. So that's definitely a character I'll be touching on in the future. As far as the book itself goes, I used Floyd was in the rescue of the Jemima and the Calloway girls.
Mhm.
And so early on, like one of the first decisions I made, so Floyd sort of becomes a framing character. So we see him interact with Boone in a way that he doesn't really he likes Daniel, of course, but he doesn't really
Yeah.
think Daniel's all that, you know. He's not it's not what he says he is. And he gets schooled really quickly
Yeah.
on that. And so when Floyd disappears from the story and is reintroduced, he's now the character who has complete trust in Daniel.
Uh-huh.
And I use that in a way that it gives Daniel a little backing with some of the other characters.
Mhm.
And this is another one of these interesting things. Depending on what you read, Floyd was there or he wasn't. So, and it's kind of hard to make the argument in some ways that he was because
Yeah.
there's a lot of reason that he wouldn't have been there.
Uh-huh.
But in my early research, especially in the older books, so I read Boone biographies back to the Bakeless biography that was written in the I think the late 30s, maybe
Uh-huh.
35, and so some of these older things he pops up as if he was there, and I had decided so early on that I wanted him to be there that I needed him there, so I sort of made it work within the narrative.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, that's a character that I really enjoyed writing.
Yeah.
So,
And which again, there's one biography I know of Benjamin Logan.
yeah,
There's a few on Kenton, you know,
yes,
loads on Boone, of course.
yeah.
But Floyd, I think I don't know if there is one that's specific to just him.
Yeah,
Um,
if you look at the you can look at the Filson Club's archives,
uh
and they had over the years presenters who would show up and
Oh,
do a presentation on Floyd. That's mostly what I found,
yeah.
and some of those contradict each other. You know, as you go further forward and backwards in time. So there's a lot
Yeah.
of picking and choosing. But as far as writing him as a character in a historical drama piece, yeah, I plan to do that at some point in the near
Mhm.
future. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And so what about Hayes? I'm gonna
Yeah,
go
Will
ahead.
Hayes. Yeah,
Will Hayes, yeah.
Hayes is Boone's son-in-law, and again, there's not a whole lot written about him in particular, but he pops up in all of Boone's biographies. Obviously, he's a really interesting character. He can be a bit of a hothead, and he was challenging to get a handle on because I needed him to fill a certain role. But one thing I knew for
Yeah.
sure is that he and Susanna, who Boone's daughter, they had a very passionate yet tumultuous relationship. They tended to fight a lot, depending on what you read, sometimes violently.
Uh-huh.
I kind of sidestepped that.
Yeah.
And so, at least what I pieced together from his personality that I used in the book was that he kind of is, he's almost like he sort of is the Robin Hood of the book. He is, before he meets Susanna, we're kind of told that he's Clark Kent.
Yeah.
And then something about meeting Susanna sort of lights a fire in him, and it changes his whole person, everything. He turns into Superman. And
Uh-huh.
so everything Will does is to impress his wife. And once I stumbled upon that concept for the character, it made him really easy to write. He was probably the
Uh-huh.
most fun character to write. So we
Uh-huh.
spend, in the middle of the book, we spend a fair amount of time with him. He's just such a ball to
Uh-huh.
get into his personality. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And which I mean, we could talk about all the characters, but we
sure,
probably don't need to talk for 2 3 hours, I guess.
sure,
Or
sure.
maybe
I
another
could,
one.
but yeah, absolutely.
Um, so and to for again to kind of recap, you get this Bryan Station, the siege of Bryan Station. That kind of goes on, and that just leads right into the Blue Licks. Simon Gertie, that's another one we didn't really um,
Yeah,
speak of, which is, oh man, he's another character to
yeah,
get into.
yeah. Again, written about quite a bit, but sort of in the margins. He's been
Hmm.
fictionalized a lot. Very
Yeah.
famously, he's a character in the Devil and Daniel Webster,
Hmm.
that tale. So, and often villainized.
Yep.
From a lot of what I read, he was a lot more complex than that. His relationships with, he had relationships with people on both sides of
Yep.
the
Uh,
Revolution, and War of
what
1812.
let's say both all three sides, if you want to say
That's a
British,
good,
American,
yes,
and
that's
the
right,
Native Americans.
that's
Uh,
right. And
very complicated guy.
everybody, everyone, each side was out to use him, and he
Hmm.
used each side in his own way.
Yeah.
And he was, again, it's much like Will Hayes. He was a fun character to write
Hmm.
once I got a sense of what he was, at least what I needed him to be for the story. It's always very
Yeah.
confusing because there's only so much history we know, and so for the purpose of the narrative, I have to sort of give things a little more structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I try not to stray too far afield. If you read about Gertie in real life, you won't find this to be a complete contradiction.
Yeah. 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 And that's one thing. I really whenever the when Gertie was first introduced in the book, he was giving the speech and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh yeah, this is Simon Gertie.
Oh, good, good.
Always a good orator,
Yes.
speaker, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah. Well, where can people get the book? It's out. It's available. Or where's the easiest place?
Yeah. Right now, the only place to get the book is on Amazon, but you can
Uh-huh.
get it for, if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free on
Oh
Unlimited.
wow. Huh.
But you can purchase it digitally or in paperback. So,
Okay.
however you like on Amazon. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it looks like right now I'm going to be at Blue Licks for, this is the 240th anniversary of the battle. So I'll be at the state park on that weekend, which is August 19th and 20th. I'm supposedly speaking or doing a
Uh-huh.
presentation on the
Yeah.
20th. So
Yeah. And they are they doing the reenactment too, or is
that's my
that?
understanding,
Uh-huh.
although they haven't announced it per se. I know the Kentucky chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution are
Uh-huh.
doing some sort of a ceremony on the morning of the 20th.
Yeah.
So maybe not that's not a reenactment exactly, but they're doing something
Yeah. Yeah.
substantial. For
Yeah.
it's fairly booked up for overnight staying, but if you're in the area, and of course there are other
Hmm.
hotels around too.
Hmm.
Uh, so yes, I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to visiting because I've written a book about it, but I've never actually been there. So
Yeah.
it'll be fascinating to
Yeah.
take a look at it in real life.
Yeah. And I know a lot of places, that have do reenactments. They kind of got hit by COVID, and everything's
Exactly.
just now picking back up as far as reenactings and all that stuff.
Right.
But they're very very cool. I've went to my first one this year, and
Yeah, I
it was
saw
pretty
that.
cool to watch.
Right.
So, um, well, anything else before we wrap it up?
Now that I do it, if you're interested in any of that stuff, I have a website, jeffwinstead.com. It's pretty easy. I'll try to update about the Blue Lick states and that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on the show again. Thanks for sending the book too. I really enjoyed it.
I'm so glad.
If you're reading, you want to check out a book, I would highly recommend checking it out, especially if you're wanting something that a little bit different from just that constant factual kind of this. I definitely feel this very entertained and captivating for myself, and I would say others as well. So. Thanks for writing it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I really appreciate you taking time to read it and have me on the podcast.
Yeah, and whenever the next book comes out, we can do it again. So
yeah, absolutely. I'll let you know. I'll keep you updated.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.